بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So today inshallah ta'ala we are doing our Quran word for word and we are resuming our tafsir session, and tonight bi'idhnillah we are going to do Surah Al-Kafirun. Surah Al-Kafirun. This is an important surah and we will discuss why, and it's a surah in which there are actually divergent understandings for the surah that actually do have some repercussions, and we'll talk about what those mean and how there's some misconceptions behind what the surah means as well, where commonly people might quote it not actually knowing what it means. And so inshallah ta'ala we'll go ahead and dive right in. So as an introduction, these are some of the names that the surah has, and I put the Arabic there. He says in one of the tafsirs that one of the names is Al-Muqashqishatayni, which means إذا يعني يقال للشيء إذا قشقش أي إذا زال المرض أو إذا أزيلت أوراق الشجر. So what it means is that Al-Muqashqisha is something that when you shake, objects fall off from it. So if you shake a tree and the leaves fall off, this is al-yuqashqish. Yani it's a so the name of the surah takes after this verb. Why? Because it is said that when a person recites it, that it purifies the individual from nifaq and from kufr and from shirk. Because it obviously talks about these ideas, right? It talks about kufr, it talks about shirk and whatnot. And so by reciting it regularly, it actually purifies the individual. And this name has been given to this surah, this specific surah, Surah Al-Kafirun, and it has also been given to Surah Al-Ikhlas, which is very important for us because these two surahs are usually tied together, and we'll talk about how. It is also one of the names that we found in some of the books is that this surah is also called Surah Al-Ikhlas. This is something that a lot of people might not know. So this is also called Surah Al-Ikhlas. Why? Because it is a prerequisite to Ikhlas. Meaning if you are doing what the Kafirun are doing, there's no way that you can actually have sincerity either. This is why it's a prerequisite to the actual Surah Al-Ikhlas that we commonly recite. This is why they're almost always recited together. When you recite Surah Al-Kafirun, you almost always follow it with Surah Al-Ikhlas. This is why it has, in some of the books, old books of tafsir, it was called Surah Al-Ikhlas as well. In one book, it was called Surah Ad-Din, because it has that word at the very end, lakum dinukum waliya din. And because through this surah we actually understand a better meaning for the word deen. Because a lot of times we translate the word deen as religion, and this is incorrect. So this surah clarifies what the word deen actually means. It is also called surah, so we call it in our mushaf, it's called Surah Al-Kafirun. Yeah, in some surahs it's called Surah Al-Kafirin with a ya. What's the difference? If I say Surah Al-Kafirun, when we call it Surah Al-Kafirun, it's correct from the perspective that that's the terminology that's used in the surah. If we say Surah Al-Kafirin, that's grammatically more correct in terms of actually saying Surah Al-Kafirin. Because saying Surah Al-Kafirun doesn't make any sense in Arabic. It's incorrect. And if I just tell somebody Surah Al-Kafirun, they'd be like, oh, you're not a Yani that's grammatically incorrect. Why? Because it's idafa. And mudaf ilayh should always have a kasra. I'm sorry, not a kasra. It's always majrura. And because it's majrura, it should have a kasra because it has what's it called? Jam' mudhakkar salim. And because of that, it should be Surah Al-Kafirin. And so some scholars wrote it like that in order to be grammatically correct. However, it would be incorrect in terms of how it's recited in the surah. This is just a little tidbit that I wanted to share for those who know Arabic to point that out, because you might find in some of the books it says Surah Al-Kafirin, but it should be Surah Al-Kafirun. But grammatically, it's correct to say Surah Al-Kafirin. And Al-Bukhari rahimahullah, in his Sahih, he does not give it any of these names. He actually gives it the name of the first verse, complete verse. And this actually is habit in a lot of surahs in which there wasn't a popular name. He just uses the first verse to name that surah. And actually the majority of old books do the same thing that Al-Bukhari does. So you might open up an older book of Islamic heritage and what have you, and you'll find that they actually quote the entire first ayah. So when was this surah revealed? The vast majority said it was revealed in Mecca, and this is because of the incident that's actually narrated. However, there's a minority, Ibn Zubayr, rahimahullah, radiyallahu anhu, and in one narration to Ibn Abbas, he said it's Madaniya, but this is far and it doesn't match what we know historically. We do know in Sahih Muslim that the Prophet ﷺ, when he did his Hajj and he did the rak'atay at-tawaf, so when he did tawaf, you do the 7 circles around the Kaaba, then after this you do the 2 rak'ahs of tawaf, that he would recite this surah and Surah Al-Ikhlas. Right? And this is recorded, which is why it's a sunnah. Now, if you recite something else, not a problem, but it is an established sunnah to recite these 2 surahs. It is also an established sunnah to recite these 2 surahs in rak'atay al-fajr and the 2 sunnahs after Maghrib prayer. So in all of these, the Prophet ﷺ recited this surah, قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ, and he recited Surah Al-Ikhlas. In fact, we have a narration, I put it up here, where he says that I saw the Prophet ﷺ, he says, بِضْعًا وَعِشْرِينَ مَرَّةً. He says, over 20-something times, do it. Meaning, I heard him. And this is the narrator, is Abdullah ibn Umar, radiyallahu anhu, where he could hear. Now, the Prophet is not reciting out loud, but at least he's reciting loud enough that somebody next to him can hear. And he narrates this, that he says that the Prophet recited these 2 surahs regularly in Fajr, the Sunnah of Fajr and the Sunnah of Maghrib. So obviously that shows their importance. We have narrations also from Aisha anha where she says that he used to end his witr with reciting 3 surahs. What are they? Surah Al-A'la and Surah Al-Kafirun and then Surah Al-Ikhlas. Almost on a nightly basis, which shows us how important they are. Oh, I have a typo there. In some ahadith it says that Surah Al-Kafirun ta'dilu rubu' al-Quran. It's equivalent to 1/4 of the Quran. And there's a hadith that actually says in which the Prophet ﷺ, they were traveling and the Prophet ﷺ led them in prayer, the Sahaba. And in the first rak'ah he recited this surah, the second rak'ah he recited Surah Al-Ikhlas, and then he tells the companions, I have just read, meaning in total, 1/3 of the Quran and 1/4 of the Quran. 1/3 of the Quran and 1/4 of the... The third of the Quran is what? Surah Al-Ikhlas, right? And 1/4 of the Quran is Surah Al-Kafirun. Next, there is a narration here by Jubair ibn Mut'im that I was able to find, that he says that the Prophet ﷺ said to him, to Jubair, after he became Muslim, of course, he says, أتحب يا جبير إذا خرجت سفرا أن تكون من أمثال أصحابك هيئة وأكثرهم زادا. He says, would you like, O Jubair, that when you go out to travel, that you should be in a good, you're wearing nice clothes, because at the time he was poor, and that you have the most zad is your preparations when you go out to travel, right? So like your luggage, your preparations for the journey, etc. And so he said, Naam. He says, I said, yes, of course. So then he said, فَقْرَأْ هَذِهِ السُّورَ الْخَمْسِ. Recite these 5 surahs from the beginning of قُلْ يَا الْكَافِرُونَ until قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ. وَافْتَتِحْ قِرَاءَتِكَ بِبِسْمِ اللَّهِ الرَّحْمَنِ الرَّحِيمِ. And when you start reciting by saying بِسْمِ اللَّهِ الرَّحْمَنِ الرَّحِيمِ. So he says, so what are the 5 surahs? Right? From قُلْ يَا الْكَافِرُونَ, it goes up until Surah An-Nas. Those are 6, those are not 5. So yeah, some said that he's skipping Tabbat Yada, and some said that he's skipping Surah Al-Nasr. Why is he skipping Surah Al-Nasr? Because it hadn't been revealed yet. Surah Al-Nasr was revealed when? Not only this, بعد الفتح نعم, بس when they said it was the last complete surah to be revealed to the Prophet before his death. So it's one of the last. It was revealed very, very, very towards the very end, Surah Al-Nasr. Which could be that it wasn't included in this. Obviously, a person can include it, this is not a problem. Okay? So he's saying recite these 5 last surahs in the Mus'haf. Of course he says, فَوَاللَّهِ لَقَدْ كُنْتُ غَيْرَ كَثِيرِ الْمَالِ إِذَا سَافَرْتُ أَكُونُ أَبَذُّهُمْ هَيْئَةً وَأَقَلُّهُمْ زَادًا فَمُذْ قَرَأْتُهُنَّ صِرْتُ مِنْ أَحْسَنِهِمْ هَيْئَةً وَأَكْثَرِهِمْ زَادًا حَتَّى أَرْجِعْ مِنْ سَفَرِي ذَلِكَ. He says, as soon as I started reciting them, I used to be poor, I used to have the worst clothes, I used to be the least person with preparations, but then after I started reciting them on a regular basis, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed me that when I would go and travel, because why is he talking about travel? He's talking about that he used to avoid travel because of its hardships, but now he was able to travel protected, well taken care of, etc. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed him. And he attributed this, if you look, and a lot of times, what happens to us when a person becomes successful in their business, what do they usually attribute that to? Themselves, right? their own acumen, their own talent. He's like, I was able to navigate this business deal, I figured this thing out, I did whatever. Where he realized, he's putting things in their proper due, right? Which is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was the one who blessed me. And he directly attributed it to him, starting reciting these surahs on a regular basis. And I think there's a good lesson in this for us, that if we start doing things, not for the sake of purely, right? So this brings up a notion. I'll take a minute, this is not part of the tafsir, but we'll take a minute to discuss inshallah ta'ala, which is doing acts of worship for the sake of the dunya. Is that permissible? Reciting the Quran should be recited for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we want reward from Him. But reward can include both the dunya and the akhirah. And this is why many scholars have said that the Muslim should always have their primary intention that this is an act of worship. I'm doing it purely for the sake of Allah because I want Allah to reward me in the hereafter. Now, can I have a secondary intention? Yes. My secondary intention, though, has to be along the lines of what Allah has already allowed or His Messenger ﷺ has allowed, which is this. He's saying, wouldn't you want Allah to bless you in this life? Of course, yes. So he says, then when you recite these as well, you'll get that intention, which means that this can be a secondary intention, but it should not be your primary intention. Because what happens, if this is his primary intention and he doesn't get what he's looking for, he might abandon it. He might stop reciting. Or the opposite, that once he does get what he wanted, he'll also stop. Right? Because he's like, khalas, I got what I wanted, so I'm going to stop. This is like a person, and I mentioned his story before, it was a friend of mine, who's doing Qiyamul Layl with the promise or the hope that he would get married. And he's like, I've been doing this for years. He comes to the Shia, I've been doing this for years, and no wife. And I've been praying, and you guys keep on telling me, if you just ask Allah, Allah will bless you, blah, 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 and I don't have a wife. He's like, let me ask you a question. If you got the wife, would you continue doing Qiyamul Layl? He says, no. I'm going to be honest. I'm not going to, I got her. Why would I? This is exactly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to extract maximum worship from you to bless you. Because all of that worship will be for you on the Day of Judgment. And perhaps even better than the wife would have been, otherwise. And it says, therefore, if you change your intention, I would have been doing this regardless. And that a part of what I want, my secondary intention is I want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless me. Then of course it changes the paradigm. Because what happens is we start to use Islam as a tool to get what we want out of this life. When Islam is not a tool, Islam is our way of life. Islam is everything. And does it help us get the maximum out of life? Yes, it does. So we kind of have to flip the coin a little bit, and it helps our perspective, inshallah ta'ala, that much more. طيب. Some recommendations from the Prophet ﷺ according to this surah. He tells multiple Sahaba, there's multiple narrations, that he tells them when you go to bed at night, you should recite this surah. And then he says, فَإِنَّهَا بَرَاءَةٌ مِنَ الشِّرْكِ. It is a salvation from shirk. It protects you from committing polytheism. It protects you from falling into shirk by reciting it on a regular basis, especially when you go to bed at night. And Ibn Abbas, radiallahu anhuma, he says, لَيْسَ فِي الْقُرْآنِ أَشَدُّ غَيْظًا لِإِبْلِيسَ مِنْهَا لِأَنَّهَا تَوْحِيدٌ وَبَرَاءَةٌ مِنَ الشِّرْكِ. Abdullah ibn Abbas is on the record saying, there is no surah that Iblis hates more than this surah. There's no surah in the entire Quran that shaitan dislikes more than this surah. Why? Because it establishes the person firmly in their religion and it completely protects them from falling into shirk. And this is obviously a thing that we should want. And obviously it protects the individual as well. So we'll go ahead and inshallah ta'ala start doing the tafsir. We're about halfway through what we promised you time-wise, We have قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ. We're just going to do the first two verses on this slide. لَا أَعْبُدُ مَا تَعْبُدُونَ. Right? So we're going to translate. Are you guys ready? What does قُلْ mean? Say. Oh. Ya ayyuha. What's ya ayyuha? Oh, you the ones who? What about Al-Kafirun? The disbelievers. La a'budu. What's la a'budu? I do not worship. ما تعبدون. What you worship. Now obviously it means who you worship, but also it could mean what you worship. Because they used to, they thought they were deities. Okay, some questions on this. Why is the command قُل used here in this surah? Yes, so it's a command to the Prophet ﷺ, but the whole Quran is قُل, right? The whole Quran is مخاطبة للنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. He's revealing it to him. But specifically, whenever we find a قُل, this is usually an answer to a question. And remember, we said the entire Quran, anytime you find قُل, this is an answer to someone's question, except for the last two surahs. Those were answers to the Prophet ﷺ's own questions. Right? We said this when we did Surah Al-Falaq and Surah Al-Nas. However, everything else in the Quran, قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ, like for example this one, it was an answer to a question that the disbelievers came with. What was their question? What did they propose? Why was this surah revealed? They had a proposal. Yes. Very good. So he says, they came to him with a proposal, like, look, he's gaining more followers, this thing is getting more popular. They said, how about we get a proposal for you? We'll worship your religion, your God for a year, and then everybody will come back and will worship our gods for a year. Their idols. And then the next year we'll do it again, and then the next year we'll just, repetition like this. Obviously, is this acceptable to a Muslim? No. There's no what's the proper term that should be used? There's no compromise in this. There are certain things, maybe it depends anyway. We obviously have to look at it, but this is in the core of the religion, who we worship, how we worship, etc. There's zero compromise at all, nothing. And this surah leaves no room for doubt that there is no compromise on the essence of the religion itself. Zero. Right? This is why it's very important to understand the surah and understand why it's important. So obviously we know that the disbelievers of Quraysh came to the Prophet ﷺ for an offer. He said, let's worship your Lord for a year, and then we all worship ours for a year, وَهَكَذَا. And it'll keep on going back and forth. The Prophet ﷺ did not respond to them when they initially came, and he waited for Allah Ta'ala to respond, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did. Okay? So it's a clear declaration. Here's a question. Because it uses Al-Kafirun, the disbelievers, why does it use this term? And, this is the question, is it general for all disbelievers, or is it specific for the disbelievers of Quraysh? Do you guys understand the question? This is an important question because depending on how we understand it is how we understand the rest of the surah and how we understand the last verse. And there are two camps within the Mufassirin. So just to get ahead while you guys think about it, there are those who said, هي عامة لكل الكافرين. It is general, even though it was meant specifically for them, obviously at the time, but it is also meant to be a general declaration for any disbeliever. Very good. There were some scholars who said, لا, هي خاصة لهؤلاء فقط. He said it is only for them. And the people who chose that it's only for them have a specific way of interpreting the verse. And we'll talk about how they interpret it. What I lean towards, at least from my reading, is that it is, yes, it was meant specifically for them, right? But however, it is general. Right? العبرة ليس بخصوص السبب وإنما لعموم اللفظ. The lesson to be taken from these verses is not just for the specific occasion upon which it was revealed, but for the generality of the meaning. And this is correct. This is why the Quran is a timeless book. Because if we say, oh, it only applies to them, so it becomes just a story, like a historical story, and it has zero application for us. And this can be problematic. Okay? So for us, is that it is general, it helps us, and it's a declaration for any type of disbeliever. Which is why Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah, he actually took from this, talking about Al-Kufru millatun wahida, and there are certain fiqhi rules that he actually derived based upon this principle that all of the kafirun are generally to be categorized as the same group. And then there's some fiqhi rulings that he had upon. So, like we said, it depends on how a person interprets the verses. And we'll get into how these verses were interpreted, inshallah ta'ala. Any questions so far? Okay. So we're going to do the next three. وَلَا أَنْتُمْ عَابِدُونَ مَا أَعْبُدُ وَلَا أَنَا عَابِدٌ مَا عَبَدْتُمْ وَلَا أَنْتُمْ عَابِدُونَ مَا أَعْبُدُ. It seems like there's some repetition, and we're going to address the repetition. So, وَلَا أَنْتُمْ. So we're doing it word for word, right? What does wala and no? Antum, you all. Abiduna, worship or are worshipping. Ma a'bud, what I worship. Wala ana abidun ma abadtum means and not. Ana, I am worshipping. Ana abidun ma, what you all worship. And then it repeats, and not you all worship what I worship. Very good. We can put them in better sentences. And you all do not worship what I worship, and I do not worship what you all worship, and you all do not worship what I worship. Okay? These are clear declarations that leaves no room for doubt, that there is no compromise when it comes to who we worship and how we worship. Now, here's the question. Why is there repetition? Why did there? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have ended it, I do not worship what you worship, you do not worship what I worship, and then that's it. Lakum dinukum waliya din. But it seems that there's two things that are repeated. There's repetition but then there's one that's clearly repeated. So how do we deal with this repetition? There are four different ways to remedy this. Or not remedy, but to explain it away, the tafsir of them. 4. So we're going to go over the 4 inshallah ta'ala. You guys with me? Is it repetition? The first opinion says yes. It is repetition of al-lafdhu wal-ma'na. So they said this is min bab al-ta'keed. So they said that al-lafdhu, both the wording and the meaning, is repeated in order to firmly establish. This is part of I repeat myself to make myself very clear. Right? This is what he's saying. And there were some scholars who had that opinion. And then one of the most brilliant points, by the way, that this proof for this is that they said because their proposal was what? Their proposal was, let's worship 1 year, and then the next, then we're going to worship Islamic way, and then the pagan way, and then Islamic way and pagan way. And it's as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is countering that by repeating it, to say it's not going to be once, it's not going to be twice, there's no repetition in this. We're not going to do this whole cycle of back and forth. Right? Because that was their initial proposal. So this is one opinion. So the first opinion says what? That it is repetition, وَهُمْ بَابِ التَّأْكِيد. And it's a response to what they said. Very good. The second opinion is that the repeated verses do not mean who I worship, it means how I worship, and this is actually correct linguistically, this is possible. So the first time that he says, لَا أَعْبُدُ مَا تَعْبُدُونَ, I do not worship what you worship. وَلَا أَنْتُمْ عَابِدُونَ مَا أَعْبُدُ, and you do not worship what I worship. But then the second round is this, and then I do not worship how you worship. وَلَا أَنَا عَابِد, عَابِد هو قالوا في هذه أنها اسم حال. So it's my situation, so I'm not worshiping how you all worship. So not only do we worship the different gods, but even the way that we worship, the way that we understand worship is even different. What you guys call worship is not really worship. So he's talking about religion, not just from the perspective, and this is why it comes, it's important in understanding that last verse, لَكُمْ دِينُكُمْ وَلِيَ دِينِ, for you religion is mine, and I have my religion, is that religion is not just who you're worshiping, but it's also how you worship. What constitutes worship in your perspective? Because in their perspective, worship was limited to just a few acts. And it's not this comprehensive thing, like being nice to your neighbor has nothing to do with worship in their mind. Obedience to one's parents or kindness to one's parents has nothing to do with worship in their mind. But for us Muslims, these are actually core elements of worship, correct? Telling the truth, not killing one's female daughters, treating everybody the same, justice, all these ideas are part of worship that they did not have. And so it's as if he's saying here that I do not worship what you worship, and I do not worship how you worship. And then the last one is, وَلَا أَنْتُمْ عَابِدُونَ مَا أَعْبُدُ, and you do not worship how I worship either. And this opinion seems very valid. Very good. The first opinion is also valid. I'm not discounting them because it could يحتمل ذلك اللفظ. If they're complementary and they don't go against each other, inshallah ta'ala both can be correct. And there's no problem in this. Everybody with me so far? So those are the two opinions. Number 3 is that it's a reference to time. The repetition is a reference to past, present, and future. So it now becomes لا أعبد ما تعبدون. I will never worship what you worship, and you do not worship what I worship, and I have never in the past worshipped what you worship. And then he tells them, and you will never in the future worship what I worship. And linguistically they go in, many of the scholars talk at how this can take place, and it's actually valid as well. However, the problem with this interpretation is what? Naam? What happens if they accept Islam? Because he's saying he's a promise for the future for them. Obviously for the Prophet ﷺ, it's a promise that he will never do it, so he's protected from falling into shirk and kufr, right? But however, for them, if he's saying, and you will never worship what I worship or who I worship, then the verse means it's specifically for those individuals that the Prophet ﷺ was talking to, like Umayyah ibn Khalaf, and all those others from the Sanadid al-Kufr, the major kuffar, right? Uqba ibn Abi Mu'ayt and others. So he says, if that's the case, then it was for them, but we cannot apply it to other kuffar. If we take it to mean future, because we don't know that. You guys understand this? However, this actually, many scholars said, at the time, there's no problem if those specific people took it that way, as a promise that they will never accept Islam, because they did. They never accepted Islam, number one. But it was also because the surah was revealed to kind of tell them that you guys are never going to change. In your stubbornness, what you guys are proposing is actually false. And you guys are not even truthful in your proposal, number one. And then, number 2, the word kafirun, we didn't mention this before, they used to hate using this word. They didn't like it. Because in their mind, I'm not a kafir. They understood what it means, because it means a denier, and they didn't like it. But he was telling him, you're a kafir because of this. You're not worshipping what I worship, etc. You're not following my way. That's what makes you a kafir. Not the fact that you have your own religion, sure, but you're rejecting this, because a kufr means to reject. Okay? So, if we take this third interpretation, it becomes a prophecy. There's a fourth opinion that I found with Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, where he says, I'm sorry. He says, لا أعبد ما تعبدون. I do not worship what you worship. اسم فعلية. And the second one, ولا أنا عابد ما عبدتم. اسم اسمية. جملة اسمية. والأولى جملة فعلية. And he says it entails a stronger assurance, ta'keed, to the impossibility of what they wanted. This is the fourth one where he seems to indicate that. Okay. For me personally, I find that the third opinion, the second, the one that says how I worship, to be the most authentic, because it matches the most and we can apply it generally. Now, if we took the third, it's fine at the time, but it cannot apply to us now. And the first one also seems fine, and it fits in with the second one as well. They're complementary, like I said. Okay? لَكُمْ دِينُكُمْ وَلِيَ دِينٌ. For you all, دِينُكُمْ, your deen. I left it as is, because we're going to translate it. وَلِيَ دِينٌ. I guess I don't have those words. Or we have a... Okay, what does the word deen mean? And then why is translating it into the word religion insufficient? Yeah, it's his whole behavior. Everything that he does. Right? We agree with this? Because what happens if we say like religion? If we just say religion. The thing is, religion, according to the religion, differs between religion and religion. So I just use the general term religion. Many Christians are only Christian on Sunday. Just like there are many Muslims, but of course this doesn't mean that it's correct. Muslims that are only Muslim on Friday. But for the most part, even Muslims know that that's incorrect, because you have to pray 5 times a day, etc., etc. You can't just show up on one day and then say, I'm a Muslim. Right? So saying religion, because religion, also within the modern context, Because we live in a secular world, right? Where religion is divorced from public life. But is that Islamically correct? No, Islam guides everything of my life, public and private. Where for many people, their understanding of religion is just my own private life, like how I practice in my home. Outside, I'm not whatever I practice inside. In my home, I can be this religious, Christian or whatever, but outside, I'm just like everybody else. Where from an Islamic paradigm, we don't deal with this. In fact, it guides everything that I do, is guided by Islam. Right? Even something as mundane as like driving. It shouldn't be guided by principles that I see just because everybody's doing something wrong. Khalas, I'll do it with them. La. Islam teaches us to be correct, just, fair in everything that we do, regardless. This is why Islam should be more comprehensive as just religion, right? And this is why it's insufficient from this point of view. So to understand the word deen, we're going to explore how it's used in some places in the Quran. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Maliki yawmuddin, what does that mean? We understand it as, this is the verse, right? In Surah Al-Fatiha. Maliki yawmuddin, the owner of the day of judgment. Yawmuddin. But it says ad-din, it uses the word deen. So if I translate it as religion, if I translate deen as religion, it becomes the owner of the day of religion. Does this make any sense? No, it doesn't. So it clearly does not mean religion. ما هو الدين هنا؟ أيوة الدين بمعنى الجزاء والحساب. Deen linguistically means your reward or punishment, your accountability. That's why if you look in some translations, they'll translate it as the owner of the day of recompense, meaning it's where you're going to get what you earned, your judgment. Ad-Deen also means judgment. If we understand Deen correctly, why? Why is it Deen judgment? So the day of recompense. We have a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, it's in Musnad Abdul Razzaq, where at the very end of it he says, فَكَمَا تَدِينُ تُدَانُ. كَمَا تَدِينُ تُدَانُ. And this is one of the most comprehensive qawa'id that we have in the religion, which is, as you do, so will be done to you. As you deal with others, so will be dealt with you. As you judge, so you will be judged. Because a lot of times we're harsh to other people, but then we expect Allah to be nice to us. That's why Allah says, in the hadith of the Prophet where he says, الرَّاحِمُونَ يَرْحَمُهُمُ الرَّحْمَنُ ارْحَمُوا مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ يَرْحَمُكُمْ مَنْ فِي السَّمَاءِ. If you have mercy upon the people of the earth, Allah will have mercy upon you. As you do to others, so will be done to you, etc., etc. And we have a lot of this in the Quran, so much. This is why they also phrase it as al-jazā'u min jins al-amal, that the reward or punishment is always going to be according to what was done. I mean, according to your deeds. This is why there's a verse in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks to the husbands that if they forgive their wives and they accommodate them and they ignore some of their faults, that Allah will do the same to them. Meaning if you're forgiving towards your wife, you're accommodating towards her, Allah will do the same to you. Because a husband can be very harsh against his wife. He can be demanding, I need you to do this, I need you to do that, why aren't you doing this, you need to go... And he's saying that if you want Allah to deal with you, look at how you deal with others. And very simply, and you can look at how you deal with your own household members. So if we understand that كَمَا تَدِينُ تُدَانُ, this actually gives us a more comprehensive idea of what deen actually means. Okay, so some better translations, like the brother said, way of life, your worldview, how you view everything. And because it colors the whole way that you see everything. It's the glasses that you put on, literally. And it's the actions that you obviously do in the world. So here it means judgment and recompense. Meaning, all of these things, what you worship and how you worship, according to that is how you're going to be judged. Which is why you have your judgment and I have mine. Because I worship completely different. And I worship a completely different God. Now it changes, because a lot of people use this verse to say what? لَكُمْ دِينُكُمْ وَلِيَ دِينِ. You have your religion, I have mine. And you have your way, I have my way. Yani you do your thing, I'll do my thing, kind of thing. Yani everything is chill and relaxed. But in fact, when we understand it now correctly, the meaning becomes what? It's a threat to them to be very careful. Because as you do in the whole world, these people, yani especially the Quraysh at the time, what were they doing? They were taking the wealth of the orphans. They were being unjust to their own family relatives. They were taking away the rights of so many people. They were doing so many evil things without any regard to anybody. And obviously, and it's not just that, it's how they worship, what they understand as worship, and who they're worshiping, which is shirk. You're going to have to deal with the consequences of your shirk. If you're committing idolatry, you're going to have to deal with the consequences. That's basically what the end verse is actually saying. This is why the Prophet ﷺ was not just commanded, "Lakum dinukum waliya din," like, leave me alone, I'll leave you guys alone. But it's actually, no, Allah will judge you according to what you're doing, and I know that Allah will judge me. Waliya din, I have my religion, I have my way, right? I have my deen, meaning I know that I have my judgment. And accordingly, and it helps us understand the surah a little bit better. It's not as I don't want to say use the word peaceful, but it's very clear that you have to tell people, and we have to be very clear that as an Islamic belief, we do believe that people will have to deal with the consequences of their actions. Now, if Allah forgives them, that's out of His bounty, His mercy, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us that bounty and His mercy. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also shadidul iqab. He's severe in His punishment as well when He wants to punish. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us and guide us. Does anybody have any questions with this? Any questions, comments, concerns? Okay. Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you all for staying and listening attentively. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you all and bless your families. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us for our shortcomings and our sins and grant us Jannah ya Rabbil Alameen. هذا والله أعلم وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.